So now that we have a bit of time between launches, I want to get into a couple of fun little videos that explore a few topics in a bit more depth. I've already covered how gaming laptops react when they're only used on battery power, but in this one, it's time to take a bit of a retrospective look at something a little bit different. Basically, how does a 2-year-old gaming laptop compare to what's currently on the market right now? While desktop PCs have relatively seen a slow performance evolution, I was actually seriously shocked by what kind of performance 2 years makes. And that's what this video is all about. And let me tell you, some of the results that you're about to witness in this video, they're just insane. For this one, I've got an interesting apples to apples comparison here, and I really have to thank Asus for stepping up to support our idea for this video and reach back into their legacy products to find this. It's the ROG Zephyrus S17 from early 2019. In the other corner, we have what that design's gradually evolved into, and that's the brand new Zephyrus S17 for 2021. By the way, if you want to buy this thing or learn more about it, make sure to check the links down below. Since it was first introduced, the S17s have been ROG's flagship 17-inch laptop, but early 2019 brought an interesting mashup of components. That's because NVIDIA launched the RTX 2000 series before Intel rolled out their 9th gen processors, so literally every gaming laptop was using an 8th gen Coffee Lake CPU with a brand new RTX card. And that's where the S17 found itself too, with a new GPU and an older CPU. Our model has an i7-8750H with 6 cores and 12 threads, 16 gigabytes of memory, an NVIDIA RTX 2080 Max-Q running around 90 watts, and a terabyte NVMe SSD. The price for this thing was, about $3,700 US. And here in Canada, it was going for around $5,000. That's way too expensive. Meanwhile, the new 2021 version is a very different animal in the way it looks and the amount of horsepower it packs. Instead of a 6-core CPU, it's got Intel's newest 11th gen Core i9-11900H with 8 cores and 16 threads. And don't think for a second that this is just like the 11th gen Rocket Lake parts that are found on desktop. It's actually not. This CPU is actually based off the 10nm Tiger Lake architecture. There's also an RTX 3080 with 16 gigabytes of VRAM that's supposed to run all the way up to 140 watts, which is actually the highest power limit we've seen so far with this GPU. Technology has also progressed to a point where Intel's now running PCIe Gen4 on their chips. So Asus added a 2TB Gen4 SSD, and its speed is freaking insane. And don't make any mistake about it, the 2019 S17's drive is even quick by the standards of today's laptops. It's just trounced by the new family member if you were to put these side by side. Another area that's seen a lot of progress in the last 2 years is in laptop displays. While most models from early 2019, like the one that I have over here, topped out at 144 Hz at 1080p, the ones today are generally faster, brighter, and can reach higher levels of color accuracy and resolution. The new S17 is a perfect example of that too. While this one has a 1440p or Quad HD screen running at 165 Hz, it covers 100% of the DCI-P3 spectrum. There's also a 4K 120 Hz model, while a 1080p option just won't be offered. Now, just looking at specs on paper, you can actually see how much things have changed. Not in that area, but also in pricing. Now sure, this isn't an inexpensive laptop by any stretch of the imagination, but our S17 will cost you about $3,300, which is hundreds less than the comparable 2019 model that went for. I'm thinking this has to do something with more competition now, especially in the CPU side. Even both generations have higher spec models that cost an absolute fortune, but overall, I think this is pretty good news. And like I said before, the rest of the current laptop space reflects this too. You see, laptop manufacturers are actually cramming in higher wattage components into slimmer and slimmer designs, and you can actually see that perfectly in the S17's evolution that brought it from a bit of a quirky design to something that's a whole lot more user-friendly. If you look at the older S17, it used to be laid out with a keyboard and trackpad pushed all the way towards the user, and that ended up for a pretty uncomfortable gaming position, especially if you didn't have a deep enough desk space since your arms would just sort of hang off the sides. The reason for this design all came down to cooling the fastest components available back then by maximizing airflow. You see, when you opened up the screen, the entire upper half of the chassis boosted itself upwards while a small stand pivoted itself outwards to raise the laptop up. Those areas served as massive intake vents. By today's standards, the i7-8750H and the RTX 2080 are pretty low on the power scale. I mean, both of those combined actually consumes less power than the RTX 3080 in today's version of the S17. And yet, when you do a direct side-by-side comparison, both the old and new designs are visually almost the same. But check this out, guys. ASUS has now managed to cram all those crazy high-end specs into a design that's more compact, a bit lighter, and almost the same thickness. We're talking roughly 20 millimeters. This thing is thin, and this trend is exactly what we've been seeing with so many laptops these days. Not only that, but now the design actually looks a lot more like a normal laptop with a standard position for the keyboard and trackpad, so that makes it much more easier to use, and that additional half pound that's been shaved off with the weight makes it a bit more portable too. Though guys, I still have to mention that this is a 17-inch laptop, so lugging it around isn't necessarily easy, especially when you include the power brick that comes with this package. Now, in order to cram massively more power-hungry components into a similar sized design, ASUS sort of attacked this in the same way they did with the previous generation, except on the refreshed S17, the entire keyboard actually elevates itself a bit to give a little bit more intake. Not only does this give a much more ergonomic typing position, but there are a few other benefits as well. First of all, ASUS was able to add a mechanical keyboard with 1.9 millimeters of key travel distance, and because it's elevated, the entire area stays a lot cooler too. They even kept the handy little volume wheel that I love so much. Seriously, I feel like every laptop should have this. But I think the most important change has actually gone under the hood, where ASUS has completely overhauled their cooling system. Now, this isn't an ASUS thing either. One of the main things that's pushing thinner laptops is that heatsink technology's advanced much faster than anything else in the last few years, like warp speed fast. So that allowed them to basically cram in higher specs or higher end specs into smaller and smaller designs. So the end result is that we have a 17-inch laptop that weighs less than only about a millimeter thicker than the older design, but it also crams in a lot of higher end components, and add to that a bigger battery, because the new heatsink takes up less space. This new version goes all the way up to 90 watt-hours, which is way bigger than the older design's 76 watt-hours. And when you couple that with the more advanced idle power management rolled out with Intel's 11th gen CPUs and RTX 3000 series, well, the difference is pretty massive. We're just looking at over 8 hours of web browsing, which isn't bad at all when you consider this thing's rocking a massive 17-inch screen. Even under heavier load, the difference is still there, but not by nearly as much, since the larger battery can't really make up for the fact ASUS is using higher wattage components on the 2021 S17. I think one of the most interesting things about new laptop designs is how well they managed to blend higher end specs and more power with thinner and lighter designs. And the S17 really isn't any different, because as I go into temperature testing, there's a trend you're going to see here, and that's cooler, faster, and more powerful. First off, let's start with the most powerful part, because like I said before, the S17's gradually been upgraded from the 2019 version's 12-thread i7-8750H to the 16-threaded i9-11900H. They're now pushing the CPU to almost 125 watts for a short period in turbo mode, followed by an average 90 watts after that. Even performance mode hits above 90 watts, but it also gets modulated a bit more to hit maximum frequencies with lower fan speeds, while silent sips down to about 60 watts. Compare that to the i7-8750H, and even in the 2019 model's highest mode, it actually sucks back less power than the i9-11900H in silent mode. Of course, the newer CPUs run at higher wattage, but this also tells us that ASUS has massive confidence in their cooling system to push the Intel 11th gen Tiger Lake chips quite high. And in every single mode, it sticks below 95 degrees and well below Intel's throttling limit. Add the older model to that, and the differences might not look like much, but in reality, they're massive, guys. Even though it's able to chuck down a lot more power, the i9-11900H's temperatures are simply much better managed at the chassis and architecture level than the i7-8750H. That also leads to a pretty crazy looking clock speed graph too, since the current S17's turbo and performance modes both try to hit a constant 4 GHz or higher. Performance mode is a bit more affected by the system trying to balance fan noise, temperatures, and frequencies, but this isn't anything out of the ordinary. On the other hand, guess where the 2019 model is? Yeah, that's right. It struggles to hit 3.2 GHz even when running balls to the walls. But running a more powerful chip at cooler temperatures and higher speeds hasn't negatively affected the amount of noise produced by the new S17 in any way. As a matter of fact, it can actually be quieter than the previous generations in certain situations. I can say the same thing about exterior temperatures as well. I mean, look, this laptop's always sported a really unique cooling design that helps keyboard temperatures in a big way. But looking at these pictures, it looks like the newer layout's even better. Plus, it allows for a pretty standard keyboard layout rather than the odd keyboard hanging off the edge look. So yeah, like I said, cooler, quieter, and more powerful. Anyways, before I get into the benchmarks, I just want to mention that I ran the 2019 version in turbo mode the whole time, and there is a reason for that. And it's something that sort of blew my mind. Even in the silent setting, the new S17's performance is actually able to match the older design's highest and loudest mode in most tests. Move to performance or turbo modes, and there's just no competition. I mean, sure, some of this is because of the additional cores, but lightly threaded tests show there's a lot of architectural enhancements too. Now, I'm not saying that you should upgrade from an expensive 2-year-old gaming laptop to the new one. The 2019 version is still a really powerful laptop in its own right. This is more about highlighting how much the laptop market has changed, and I think these numbers really do speak for themselves. Moving on to the GPU, and one of the Zephyrus S17's big claims to fame is the fact that it runs an RTX 3080 16GB card at up to 140 watts. And that's exactly what happens in turbo mode. Even performance mode runs to an average of 130 watts. Silent, well, that's an interesting one since ASUS's firmware is making on-the-fly adjustments to keep the GPU and CPU well within strict temperature zones. On the older version of this laptop, ASUS was forced to use a max-Q version of the RTX 2080, so it ends up consuming a lot less power. I mean, barely 90 watts in our testing. It also doesn't have the advanced Optimus that ASUS added to the S17 in 2021, which is another reason why this newer version is allowed to consume more power. Just like with the CPU testing, temperatures are kept under super strict control on the refreshed S17. Remember, this is a 140-watt RTX 3080 with 16 gigabytes of memory in a chassis that's only about 2 centimeters thick. And that's, well, pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 Max-Q starts pretty strong, but then its temperatures gradually rise to become the hottest running here. This is where ASUS's new advanced cooling design is so much better than the one in the older version. Now in gaming, well, I'm sure you guessed it, the competition isn't even close, at least in the performance and turbo modes. As a matter of fact, there's very little separating the two modes. Both of those beats the pants out of the older design without any problem at all. But while Silent was ultra competitive in CPU testing, it's fallen a bit behind here. A lot of that is because of how ASUS controls GPU power in this mode, but it is still surprisingly close to the 2-year-old S17. I'm guessing a lot of that comes down to the changes NVIDIA did on an architectural level between Ampere and Turing. Another possibility is silent mode is hitting higher average clock speeds than our 1-second logging can pick up. Well, I guess that pretty much wrapped things up, and I'm still pretty shocked by these results. You see, many people have been complaining about how slow the desktop market's been progressing, and it turns out the real news is actually happening within gaming laptops. You see, the old saying used to be, dude, don't get a laptop, just buy a desktop if you want performance. But now, those things are actually becoming closer and closer to desktop level performance, while also becoming more portable. Those days of carrying, brick-sized gaming laptops is pretty much done. And like we saw, a lot of this is due to companies willing to push power levels without sacrificing size, temperatures, or even battery life. And if this much progress has been made over the course of the past 2 years, I just can't wait to see what the next few years are going to bring to the table. I mean, are we expected to get RTX 3080 performance into thin and light laptops? I mean, one can dream, but it's a possibility. Because, if these guys are willing to just innovate and push themselves, things can happen, people. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. Let us know what you guys think about the progress that we've made in terms of laptops. Are you impressed by the performance? Yeah, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I'm your brother, Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.